Okay. Welcome, dis and dat, the autonomous collective.net, 24 April. The reprinting, I guess, was the release with a prequel and a epilogue by the author of a book called Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism. And it's an interesting book because the authors all went to jail. It's a description of a very different time relative to left politics. Um, Essentially, it covers it is a technical argument, and the prequel and or the preface and the epilogue sort of discuss that. The epilogue brings it up to date. There's a preface, and then there's a forward written by our friend Henry. And this book was just released last week, I think, and it's free, available on the publisher's um, website in a PDF form, so one can get hold of it. We have it in our Discord for that reason. It is a book by the Communist Working Group. The original introduction was by Agiri Emanuel, and Torkil Lawson, new prologue and epilogue. He served 4 of 10 years of a 10-year sentence for bank robbery. Henry Hakamaki and Nemanja Lukash do the preface, and it's an interesting little book. I mean, in the sense that, you get a snapshot of an argument, a technical argument about unequal exchange, which I will sort of refer here, but I'll just be reading things like the preface, the forward, and the epilogue because of time, certainly. But I think it's a worthy book in the sense that it reminds us, as I think Henry reminds us, that action is much more important. So, originally published underground in 1986 and long unavailable in print, Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism is one of the clearest, most uncompromising anti-imperialist texts of the late 20th century, written by the Communist Working Group in Denmark, CWG. The book offers a sharp and accessible analysis of how global capitalism from the global south through unequal exchange and how that extraction shapes class complicity within the imperial core. So it is a restoration of the original text, and it is situated in its historical moment, while clarifying its relevance to the contradictions of global capitalism today. And far more than a critique, the book is a call to action, challenging revolutionaries in the global north to confront their material position in the imperial order and to take seriously the kind of politics demanded by real solidarity. Unapologetically internationalist and rooted in material analysis, unequal exchange, and the prospects of socialism, remains essential reading for anyone serious about dismantling empire from within. That's the cover. Here's the preface. When mining the annals of radical thought in libraries and dusty boxes, 2 questions arise. Why choose this specific text to republish? And how is it relevant today? These questions will not be answered directly and succinctly, but rather are a through line within this preface. The Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism was penned by the incisive minds of the Communist Working Group in Denmark in 1985 as a culmination of 2 processes: the development of their own parasite state theory and the practice based on international solidarity with the national liberation movements in the Third World. This text served as a clarion call for the dissection of global capitalism's most pernicious mechanisms. Its original publication, first appearing in English in 1986, coincided with the era of Reaganomics and Thatcherism, a time when the siren songs of the free market were at their most seductive, and the specter of socialism was dismissed as a relic of a bygone age. Despite the environment present during the Cold War, the Communist Working Group, unfettered by the shackles of dogma, dared to peer beyond the horizon and envision a future where the principles of socialism could transcend the confines of national borders and permeate the very fabric of global trade. They posited that unequal exchange between the core and periphery was not merely a symptom of capitalism's excesses, but a foundational stone upon which the edifice of inequality was constructed. This perspective, once deemed radical, now resonates with an eerie prescience as we grapple with the stark disparities laid bare by the digital age and the ever expanding reach of transnational corporations. In a time when the very concept of socialism is being reevaluated and redefined, unequal exchange serves as a beacon guiding us through the murky waters of economic theory with a firm hand and a clear vision, forcing us to keep in mind the uncomfortable truths about the contradictions of the struggle itself. The ideas within these pages have remained potent, biding their time, awaiting the moment when the cracks in the capitalist edifice would once again allow them to seep into the collective consciousness. That moment is now, as we proudly present to you a new edition of this seminal work, replete with an extensive new prologue and epilogue by Torkil Lawson, one of its original architects. This republication is not merely an act of nostalgia or historical preservation, it is a declaration of relevance. The world has changed significantly since the first edition saw the light of day, but the core principles of exploitation and inequality that the text so masterfully elucidates remain as entrenched as ever. The digital age, the entrenchment of neoliberalism, and the relentless march of capitalist globalization have not only failed to eradicate the disparities identified by the CWG, but have in many cases amplified them. The chasm between the haves and have-nots has grown wider, and the desperation of the latter more profound. The concepts of unequal exchange, which the group dissected within this text, are as vital today as they were when the book was first released, perhaps more so. In a time when the very fabric of society is being stretched to the breaking point by the insatiable hunger of the capitalist market, we are reminded that the struggle for a more equitable world is not anachronistic, but rather a pressing imperative. The new prologue that Lawson has provided is an examination of the birth of the CWG, the internal dynamics of the group, and the era in which they were operating in, as well as specific actions that the group was taking. It also serves to explicate the origins of their interest in unequal exchange and the creation of the original text. Through understanding the processes of the creation of this text and the social realities under which the CWG were operating, readers will be equipped with the necessary tools to best utilize the material within. Lawson's new epilogue serves as a bridge between the past and the present, casting a discerning eye over the intervening decades. He dissects the evolution of the system critiqued in the original text, revealing how it has morphed and adapted to maintain its stranglehold on power. In addition, it is a call to arms, not for a return to the rigid structures of yesteryear, but for a socialism that is flexible, adaptable, and responsive to the complexities of the modern world. The original publication comes with the intellectual endorsement and introduced by Aguirre Emanuel, the scholar whose name is tightly associated with the term unequal exchange, and whose work served as a theoretical basis for Wallerstein's conception of core-periphery hierarchy. Emanuel was not merely an intellectual contributor to the ideological work of CWG, he was also a friend and sympathizer of their struggle. The most striking difference between this and other works on the subject is the focus on the activist audience. Prior to the discussion and elaboration of unequal exchange theory, the topic was constrained within the high walls of academia, protected by technical language, and a high learning curve that had prevented activist and intellectual access to it. Unequal exchange and prospects of socialism is a bridge between the two worlds, making a very complex topic accessible, easy to understand, to those who carry the struggle on their shoulders. While it reduces the complexity of the topic, it does not oversimplify it nor banalize it. As such, it received positive critique from the authorities in the field, such as Samir Amin and Emanuel Wallerstein. With this new edition, we aim to reintroduce the ideas of unequal exchange and the prospects of socialism to a new generation of activists and thinkers. Not just a historical artifact, it is a living document, a toolkit for those who wish to understand the structures that perpetuate inequality. It is a declaration that the quest for a more equitable world is an ongoing one, that the lessons of the past are as vital to our future as the oxygen we breathe. Iskra Books is dedicated to the dissemination of knowledge that empowers the oppressed, and in this spirit, we've taken great care to ensure that this revised version remains true to its original vision while also containing notes from Lawson that speak, or Lawson, remains true to its original vision while containing notes that speak to the realities of the 21st century. The book's exploration of unequal exchange is as pertinent today as it was 3 decades ago. The global economy, with its labyrinthine networks of trade and finance, continues to siphon wealth from the global south to the north, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. The original text analysis of the commodity form and the nature of value in capitalist societies remains a foundational text for those seeking to understand the roots of poverty and exploitation. The republishing of this work is an act of solidarity with those who have and continue to fight for a better world. It is a nod to the countless individuals and communities who have borne the brunt of capitalism's depravity and who have refused to accept their fate with quiet resignation. In the face of a system that seeks to commodify every aspect of human existence, the book stands as a reminder that another world is not only possible but necessary. It is a foundation to stand on for those who wish to dismantle the edifice of inequality brick by brick and build in its place a society founded on the principles of justice, solidarity, and human dignity. As we stand on the precipice of a new era with the old order teetering and the future uncertain, it is more crucial than ever to look at the wisdom of our forebears. The new prologue and epilogue by Torkel Lawson serve not only to contextualize the original work, but to breathe new life into its pages. We believe that unequal exchange and the prospects of socialism will resonate with a readership hungry for answers in a time of turmoil. We hope that it will inspire readers to look beyond the surface of our globalized society and to recognize the deep structural inequalities that underpin it, and most importantly, to join in the struggle to create a more just and equitable future for all. In the spirit of the original text, this new edition is not a definitive answer to the riddles of our time, but rather a provocation, a spark that we hope will ignite the fires of critical thinking and radical imagination. We publish it not as a final word, but as a conversation starter, inviting readers from diverse backgrounds and ideological persuasions to engage with its arguments, to challenge its premises, and ultimately to enrich the discourse on the left. First, Antonio Gramsci once said, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." We believe that within the pages of this book, one can find the tools to slay the monsters of inequality and give shape to the nascent world that yearns to emerge. All right. There's the introduction to the first edition by Emmanuel, and I'm trying to get a sense of, let me say that it's good and important. It does have, well, I might as well read it. The hell with it. We will go over time a little bit. Aguirre Emmanuel, often in meetings, academic or other, where I was to put the case for my theses on unequal exchange and on the international exploitation, which was its outcome, sincere left-wing militants, somewhat at sea, asked the same question in different forms. If this is the case, if the proletariat no longer exists in our industrialized countries, if all, or almost all, wage earners, white collars and blue collars together, have become a labor aristocracy by definition, producing less value than their wages allow them to appropriate, and thus becoming the objective allies of imperialism, which brings them the supplement, what then becomes of the political action of revolutionary Marxists? To whom, to which class, to which strata of society can they therefore address themselves? This question visibly worried them as much as it troubled me. For it is not exactly easy to say to those who have committed their lives to a cause and who have already sacrificed part of it thereto, that they have quite simply mistaken their side. This is the question to which the members of the Kommunistiska Arbeitsgruppe, Communist Working Group, CWG, have replied in this book. One must, they say, quite simply put oneself at the service of the classes which have an interest in overthrowing imperialism. no matter where they are geographically. This is clearer and more distinct than anything I've ever been that I've been able to mumble in answers here and there to my various questioners. This reply is threefold. In the first instance, it asserts that the modern structuralist idea of history without actors is unacceptable. The social revolution is borne along by living men. It is not the forces of production which rise up against social relationships. The objective internal contradictions can only replace one structure by another by mobilizing the classes which have an interest in this change. Without that, there is but one alternative to socialism: barbarity and generalized chaos. It is precisely because of the impossibility today of identifying these classes that the theory of a revolution without revolutionaries has been able to germinate in the minds of part of the intelligentsia in our industrialized countries. It would have sufficed to place oneself at a point where one viewed the world as a whole to see that these vectors exist. Thereafter, it reminds us today that the revolution is of necessity anti-imperialist. In the borderline case, a social revolution in any of the countries of the center, supposing even that this could take place, would not lead to socialism, but to social imperialism. On the other hand, an anti-imperialist victory in the third world, even without a direct socialist content, would indirectly open the way to socialism, if only by the impoverishing and reproletarianizing of the center. Nevertheless, the surest way would be a break by the underdeveloped countries, both with the capitalist system internally by means of planning and with imperialism externally by the elimination of unequal exchange. The first is an internal matter. The second implies that these countries act in concert internationally. Finally, this thesis shows that while the conflict is international, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a conflict of nations. It means it remains a class conflict. But classes can only fight where they exist, not where they do not exist. Now, as a result of some historical changes which Marx could have not forecast, classes are no longer distributed geographically today according to the classical intra-national model. The proletariat, the true party to the cause of the socialist revolution, has practically disappeared in the affluent countries of the center. It continues to exist in the periphery. Thus, when the people of, for example, El Salvador revolt, it is primarily against their local exploiters that they turn, and the fact that by fighting them they are led to fight their external allies at the same time in no way changes the classical scheme of the class struggle. What does change is that these allies of the capitalists in El Salvador are no longer only, and not even to any great extent, the capitalists, but also and above all the working class in the United States. Of course, this does not mean that all the conflicts in the world are dependent on the class struggle. There are major conflicts: the struggle of the Palestinians against Zionist colonialization, that of the Irish Catholics against another type of white settlers, that of the blacks in South Africa against apartheid, etc., which have nothing to do with the class struggle. But does this mean that any class struggle in which the ultimate issue at stake is the socialist transformation today inevitably transcends the national level and directly implies an anti-imperialist commitment? On the other hand, nor does this mean that the workers and the capitalists of the imperialist center have straightened out everything, which separates them. But what separates them is no longer an antagonistic opposition, that is to say, an opposition which can only be resolved by going beyond the existing system. It is an opposition between partners for the sharing of the spoils in the framework of the system. This is the very meaning of reformism, or reformism. They are, therefore, natural allies in any outcome in which it is a question of confronting the suppliers of these spoils. It is not a question of political immaturity of the masses and betrayal by the leaders. It is a question of the contrary, an awareness on the part of the masses of their true interests. No class in the imperialist countries has a stake in the overthrow of imperialism. The fundamental process remains the same: accumulation of wealth at one pole is the same at the same time accumulation of misery at the opposite pole. But instead of taking place internally today, this process takes place internationally. The zero-sum game, the condition for the irreducible antagonism, has moved from a national to an international level. whereas within the imperialist center, a positive sum game unites the classes over and above their oppositions. Must we conclude that imperialism, far from being a stage of capitalism, is a prerequisite, therefore, according to some theses, for example, Cher's Latouche, in circulation at the moment? Should we go as far as to say that the destruction of imperialism would mean ipso facto and automatically the collapse of capitalism by the simple disappearance of the necessary condition of its existence? Certainly not. I would even say that I do not see the meaning which these theses could have when it is a question of capitalist countries which are subject to imperialism instead of practicing it. Should we then admit that imperialism precedes and gives rise to capitalism in the two directions, both as regards its beneficiaries and its victims? Much more conventionally, Bill Warren only speaks of the pioneering of imperialism in the countries dominated and exploited by it, where it is a question of the acceleration of the spread of the capitalist relationships already existing in the centers of imperialism. But in both cases, how can we explain the fact that capitalism has developed in Latin America and in India, much less than in Spain or in Greece? None of these countries have practiced imperialism, and the last two have certainly been less subject to it than the first. These theses only take on a definite meaning if one restricts the definition of capitalism to reduce it to its special case, that of overdeveloped capitalism. Then, yes, naturally, it's easy to understand that without imperialism abroad, capitalism would never have been capable of ensuring the masses at home the affluence of the countries of the center. Depriving these countries of the fruits of imperialism would not automatically overthrow capitalist relations in general in these countries, but would put an end to this aberrant, atypical, non-antagonistic capitalism, which is the consumer society, and as a result, would put the normal process of the class struggle, which will destroy these relations, back on the rails. This, rather crudely summarized and imperfectly interpreted, seems to be the position of the authors. But the latter have not been satisfied with producing a formula. They have inferred a line of political action from it and are themselves personally committed to it. They practice the geographical delocalization about which they speak. They have crossed the front lines and have put themselves at the service of the organized revolutionary movements in the South. The structure of this book reflects the progress of their praxis, as I've been able to witness it through personal contacts which I have had with them. Firstly, to know the world, then to transform it, but to know the world as it is today and not as it was in Marx's time, and nevertheless to do this by using the Marxist method. It's not very easy for me to judge the first part, which is devoted to reflection. Its convergence with my own ideas is such that I am inhibited for fear of being partial. But I admire the second part devoted to their action, not only and not so much for the courage that implies and the tasks inherent to this type of adventure, but especially for the amount of moral courage that one has to have if one is not to be content with giving up one's own illusions, but tries to dissipate those of others by striking head on at the wishful thinking which is so widespread, so conventional, and so respectable as that of the present generation of young left-wing idealists in our industrialized countries. Now, the prologue. Let me just say that the prologue is perhaps more polemic than the epilogue. The epilogue really gets down to it, and we may not get there today, but I will urge that you might read it. The struggle goes on anti-imperialist praxis in the global north. Torkel Lawson, or Lawson. One might ask oneself, why read this book, a text written nearly 50 years ago about the political economy of imperialism and the struggle for socialism? The short answer is that the struggle goes on in the history, and that history is not only a condition of the current struggle, but also reaches into the future. Our reading of the anti-imperialist struggle in the long 60s has an impact on our current strategies and thus on our actions now, and will continue to have an impact in the future. The past, the present, and the future are dialectically connected and interdependent. The ideas of socialism, from Marx and Engels to the struggle of the Third World Revolutionary Movement, still have an impact because the hope they raised drive us to act and to realize those ideas in the future. A longer answer to the question above can be divided into two parts. Firstly, the book was written by an anti-imperialist organization not only as a theoretical analysis of imperialism, but also as a development of strategy and praxis to be followed by revolutionaries in the global north. The book reflects the experience of building an organization and developing a praxis. The continuity of the struggle is important. Experience must be passed on, as at once time we received it. Secondly, the book's analysis of the political economy of imperialism can be used as a basis for updating the perspective on how imperialism works today, again with the purpose of developing strategy and praxis for the continuing struggle. This introduction elaborates on those two answers, the organizational experiences of the group of which I was a member, and the development of imperialism and the prospects for socialism today. In this way, the first part of this introduction expands and clarifies the concluding chapter, that is, chapter 6, what can communists in the imperialist countries do? Matters which could not be described at the time of publication or elaborated upon here or there. At the time, we were very careful, ensuring our words were not overly specific so as not to give hints as to our illegal activities. Ha! The second part of this introduction is an evaluation of the strategy presented in the book. On this basis, an update on contemporary anti-imperialist strategy is outlined. Number one, the ones we were, the Communist Working Circle, CWC, was founded by Gottfried Appel in December 1963 as a split from the Danish Communist Party, DCP, which was loyal to the Soviet Union at the time of the Sino-Soviet split. The DCP was, at the time, a large party due to its active role in the struggle against Nazi Germany's occupation of Denmark during the Second World War. The older members carried experiences and knowledge from the struggle in the 1930s and 40s. However, situated in the Scandinavian welfare state, the DCP soon slipped into reformism and focused on parliamentarism. It was the lack of a thoroughgoing revolutionary spirit in the DCP and the compromising attitude of the mother party in the Soviet Union after the 20th Party Congress in 1956, Khrushchev, on one side, and the inspiration from the anti-revisionist faction in China and from the national liberation struggle in Vietnam on the other side, which made up the idea for the formation of the CWC. Developments in China have for some time been Appel's chief interests. When ideological disputes between Moscow and Beijing emerged in the early 1960s, Appel sided with Beijing. In autumn 1963, Appel left the party newspaper to work for the Chinese embassy's journal Bulletin. When he was expelled from the DCP shortly thereafter, he and 20 other DCP dissidents founded the Communist Working Circle. Appel was trained at the Higher Party School in Moscow in the 50s, and upon his return to Denmark, he led study circles to teach new DCP members the foundations of Marxism. He had been in charge of DCP's publishing house, was a journalist in the daily newspaper, and was responsible for contact to the Chinese Communist Party. CWC became Europe's first Maoist organization and remained in contact with the Communist Party of China from 1963 to 69. CWC hoped that once they examined the mistakes of DCP's revisionism, more members from DCP would join them, but it was not so. The same negative response came from left-wing trade unions and workers in the large Copenhagen factories. Danish workers struggled for little more than higher wages. Socialism held no appeal, and solidarity with the working classes in the Third World was not on the agenda. CWC policy had more appeal to young people in the late 60s. CWC had a strong internationalist orientation. It was the first organization in Denmark to call for a demonstration against the Vietnam War on February 8th, 1965. The same year, CWC initiated a program to collect funds for North Vietnam. In 1966, CWC founded the Vietnam Committee. This anti-imperialist solidarity work became the main source of new members and sympathizers for the organization. This made Appel reconsider his approach. CWC would develop a unique profile within the European left. The Danish working class had no immediate revolutionary potential. The concerns of the Danish working class were very different from those of third world workers. Danish workers demanded longer vacations, a higher pension, and a raise of $1 US dollar per hour. Third world workers were starving, did not have a single day off, and were lucky to earn $1 a day. A series of articles under the heading Perspectives for Our Struggle were published in communistic orienteering. One of them explained the working class has no chance of toppling the capitalist class and introducing socialism before the foundation of the capitalist class has been undermined by the struggle and at least partial victory of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Western Europe was not a dry prairie to be ignited by the revolutionary spark, as in the Third World, but rather a damp meadow. CWC's theoretical grounding for this conclusion was that the profits brought home over decades by the imperialist countries from colonies and dependent countries had in part been used to turn the former dangerous classes of the nation into loyal citizens. For sure, the working class wanted a higher living standard, but socialism? For this they showed no interest. They were a labor aristocracy, in the words of Lenin. Super exploitation and other forms of value transfer had created the foundation of an imperial mode of living in Western Europe and North America. In 1966, the essence of what is called the parasite state theory was outlined in communist orienteering article emphasizing the consequences of the theory of socialists in the rich countries. If we want socialism to become a reality in the Western world, including Denmark, then it is our highest duty to support oppressed nations and peoples in their fight against Western capitalism, the common enemy. CWC considered the victory of the peoples of the Third World over imperialism the decisive factor which would then lead to a revolutionary situation in Europe and North America. Any weakening of the neo-colonial grip of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America would entail a weakening of imperialism and tend to revive class antagonisms, and so too class struggle in the imperialist countries. In that sense, it was not just a projection of the missing revolution in Denmark made by romantic revolutionaries onto the Third World. The main task was still to be able to pinpoint the turn of events that would create a revolutionary situation in Denmark. This analysis had also some organizational implications. The leadership of CWC were wondering if it was at all possible to build a revolutionary organization in Denmark, where the social circumstances were not ripe for radical change, and the wish for socialism in the working class diminutive. If it was possible, what could such an organization look like? Would it be possible to mobilize members with the dedication and discipline needed for such an organization? What should their praxis be? In the late 1960s, much of the anti-imperialist activities in Denmark focused on demonstrations. The young sympathizers with CWC were at the forefront of these activities. In 1969, The Green Berets, a film starring John Wayne about the U.S. Special Forces in Vietnam, premiered in Denmark at a large Copenhagen cinema. In the screening hall, chairs were smashed and butyric acid poured on the carpet. We also participated in the militant demonstrations against the World Bank meeting of 1970. The aim was not just to protest, but to actually stop the event. Molotov cocktails were thrown through the windows of the Congress Center, but sprinklers prevented greater damage. The development of the organization became a human resources management human resources management project. Out of the crowd who were attracted by the radical profile and protest actions by CWC's frontline organization Anti-Imperialist Action Group, members were recruited. One criterion was dedication. New members were expected to prioritize political work over personal lives and careers, but dedication was not enough. Discipline was another criterion. The dedicated but wild ones were sorted away, even though some were eager to become full members. What was needed was an organization of more or less professionals dedicated and able to act in unity and discipline after a strategy laid down by the leadership of the organization. There was no formal democracy in CWC, not even statutes. Instead, a recognition of the experience and knowledge of the leadership. The leadership was exercised by direct contact between 3 to 4 leading members and individual members and subgroups handing out tasks. This structure was only possible due to the small size of the organization. The lack of democracy and formal rules did not seem to be a problem in the beginning, but it became one later. What had such an organization to offer? What was the attraction which led me, among others, to join the group when I was offered membership? First, the analysis. The parasite state theory corresponded to my everyday experiences. It explained that there was a direct connection between the wealth in our part of the world and the poverty elsewhere, imperialism. The parasite state theory also explained why the working classes in our part of the world were not interested in revolution, but only in changes to the ruling system that would grant them a bigger share of imperialist plunder. The analysis was followed up by clear strategy: support the liberation struggle in the Third World to cut the pipelines of imperialist value transfers. My individual, uncoordinated, and emotional political approach gave way to an organized and strategic one. Furthermore, the strategy advised a concrete praxis, that is, support the liberation struggles, not only by words of protest, information, and demonstration, but also in deeds and material support. Solidarity is something you could hold in your hands, as we used to say. There was a clear line between analysis, strategy, and action. I knew what I had to do, and CWC offered the organizational framework. Second, dedication and discipline. It was not only the logic in CWC's theory that appealed to me, it was also the commitment and integrity of the members. From the first encounter with a member, Holger Jensen, I felt that there was a strong correlation between what was being said and what was being done, in contrast to much of the left at the same time. It was not just proclamations on what should be done, there was a willingness to do the job. No one said, "Sorry, I do not have time at the moment." Comrades came on time, well prepared, and were working tirelessly. The strong unity in the political outlook in the small group of 30 to 40 more or less professional and disciplined activists created unity in action and energy to manage a huge number of tasks. As the organization had a publishing house, membership also offered the opportunity to learn how to produce informational material from layout and reproduction to offset printing and binding books. Third, schooling and theoretical development was an important component in the group. With the background of decades in the Danish Communist Party, the old comrades knew their classics. There were weekly study groups and sometimes longer seminars, but schooling was seldom done in the form of general and abstract appropriations of Marxism. We needed methods that tied analysis and practice together. Marxism can only be properly studied when we are committed to action. Hence, the Marxist classics were brought in to help solve specific problems in the development of our strategy. The political economy of Marxist capital was used to explain forms of imperialist value transfer. The dialectic materialism of Mao was used to find the principal contradiction. State and class theory from Lenin was used in order to define the characteristics of the social democratic welfare state and class struggle in the parasite state. Finally, historical materialism was used to explore how Scandinavia was integrated in the imperialist core. But also, more specific limited issues were analyzed. What was the position of migrant workers in Europe? What was the hippie culture an expression of? For a period of time, 4 comrades lived and worked in Frankfurt, and there were study trips for all members to the Ruhr industrial district of Germany in order not to limit our perception of European capitalism to the Scandinavian welfare states. On top of this, and most importantly, came the specific economic analysis of different third world countries and their political movements to decide who and how they could be supported. This was not only done by studying books. In the late 60s, we were certain that North Vietnam and FNL, the Front de Libération Nationale in Algeria, would defy U.S. imperialism. In the spirit of Che Guevara, we wanted to contribute to the establishment of 2, 3, many Vietnams. We wanted to transfer the energy from our solidarity with the Vietnamese struggle to other struggles in the Third World. This seemed very possible at the time. There were revolutionary movements in the Congo and the Portuguese colonies of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. There was armed resistance against Ian Smith's settler regime in Rhodesia and militant struggle against apartheid in South Africa, as well as South African rule in Namibia. There were revolutionary movements in the northeast of India and in Nepal, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and the Philippines. In the Middle East, the liberation struggle in Palestine received much attention due to its international actions. A left-wing government came to power in South Yemen. The liberation struggle in Oman was on the rise. In Iran, there was widespread resistance against the Shah. In Latin America, revolutionary movements were active from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. If, in the early 1970s, one looked at a map of the world and took note of all the countries that had active liberation movements, the future of socialism looked very promising indeed. There were over 40 attempted revolutions in the Third World between 1945 and 1975. The zenith was in 1968, in which the rebellions occurred in all three worlds at the same time. Young people and students rose up in Western Europe, and the Black Panther Party was on the offensive in the USA. To develop our strategy and to make the decision about where to concentrate our limited efforts and resources, we studied the economic and political development of a number of countries across the global South. In addition, we traveled to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to experience the situations there firsthand and to make personal contact with the liberation movements. Our travel experiences and talks with liberation movements convinced us of their revolutionary potential. There was an objective interest in a different world and a subjective will for revolutionary change. By supporting the struggle there, we could contribute to a radical change of the world order. As a result of Third World liberation movements' victories, we expected socialist states to emerge that would put an end to the super profits of transnational companies and the unequal exchange between the world's rich and poor countries, and thereby foster a new urgency around the contradiction between the capitalists and the working classes in our own part of the world. In order to maximize the result of our efforts, we had to identify the regions that seemed economically and politically the most important for imperialism. We identified the Middle East as one such area. The region's oil reserves were of vital interest. The Middle East also had geopolitical importance. It lay along the transport routes to and from Asia, and it was close enough to the Soviet Union for the U.S. to launch a military attack. We also tried to evaluate the class struggles in the regions where liberation movements operated. Was there a revolutionary situation? Which objective and subjective forces were involved? By objective forces, we meant the classes that were in motion, regardless of their level of organization or involvement in revolutionary parties. They were in motion out of necessity due to their miserable living conditions. They could move in different directions, these depending on the ability of the subjective forces to analyze, organize, and mobilize. The subjective forces were the revolutionary organizations. In the 1970s, there were often several organizations claiming to be so in the same region. This meant that we had to study and evaluate the potential of each one. Relevant questions were, is their ideology nationalist or class-based and socialist? What does their organizational structure look like? How do they relate to the objective forces, that is, the masses? What are their strategies, tactics, and specific practices? We needed to support the right movements in the right regions, the regions that were most important for the maintenance of imperialism. Witnessing the living conditions in the Third World and collaborating with Third World revolutionaries strengthened our commitment, the wish for justice, and our outrage at imperialist oppression. It sparked a feeling of personal responsibility. Third World liberation movements were no longer abstract political entities, but now consisted of real-life people and comrades to whom we felt obliged. We found it was our duty to support the struggle waged against neocolonialism in the Third World while simultaneously preparing ourselves for the outcome of the struggle in our own country. After years as an active sympathizer, I became a member of CWC. Longtime personal knowledge was a precondition before you were let in, making it very difficult to infiltrate the group. Being a member, I felt like a little cog in a big machine fighting for a different world order. Emotions were the driving force, theory provided guidance, organization brought structure, and practice gave concrete results. The practice huge demonstrations against the World Bank Conference in Copenhagen in 1970 made us reflect on the utility of fighting with the police in the streets. At the same time, we had our trips to Jordan, Lebanon, and Mozambique, which made the needs of the liberation movement specific, and we made personal contacts which made practical cooperation possible. So the decision was made to scale down political activities to influence the political situation in Denmark and instead focus on material support to the Third World liberation movements. In the following years, it developed into two distinct and separate forms of providing material support, legal and illegal. Material support can consist of many things: money, equipment, medicine, weapons, and logistical assistance. But it can also consist of other forms um, mm, uh, of service. For example, studies that the liberation movements ask for but do not have the times, resources, or data to conduct. What all forms of material support have in common is that they can be put to concrete use. In 1971, CWC founded an organization with a rather inconspicuous name, Taj Til Africa, TTA, Clothes for Africa, to provide material support. Its members were CWC, sympathizers, and other anti-imperialists, but the goal was not to push ideology. The organization collected clothes to be sent to refugee camps run by the liberation movements in Africa and the Middle East. We also organized flea markets and ran secondhand stores to generate cash. On weekdays and during holidays, we sorted and packed them by the ton. They were then transported to Hamburg and shipped to destinations where they could be received by the liberation movements. TTA had chapters in Copenhagen and four other Danish towns, and during its heyday, it had about 100 members overall. In the 1970s, TTA supported Frelimo in Mozambique, the MPLA in Angola, ZANU in Rhodesia, and SWAPO in Namibia, and the PFLO in Oman. In the 1980s, it also supported a Black Consciousness project in South Africa by the name of Isalwanda Revolutionary Effort, IRE, as well as the New People's Army in the Philippines. In addition to clothes, shoes, blankets, tents, and medicines, we sent the money we made from the flea markets held every month, amounting to around $100,000 per year. This work also allowed us to spread information about the liberation struggles and recruit new sympathizers and members. In the 80s, we also established Café Libération, run by activists, to generate a profit for the liberation movements. CWC had a print shop which produced the leaflets and posters for the collection of material, but also magazines, pamphlets, and posters for the liberation movements. Undercover, our, our relationship with the Palestine movements began in 1969 when the group from CWC went to Lebanon and Jordan in 1969, traveling by car through Europe. We were especially impressed by the analysis of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. The slogan, "Our enemies are imperialism, Zionism, and Arab reactionaries," spoke to us. The State of Israel is a distinct settler colonial project, but at the same time, it serves a certain purpose for U.S. imperialism. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, writes in 1896, "The Jewish state. There in Palestine we shall be a sector of the wall of Europe against Asia. We shall serve as the outpost of civilization against barbarism." This factor makes the struggle of the Palestinian people important globally, above and beyond the battle for national liberation. We did not primarily support the PFLP because it wished to establish a Palestinian nation state, but because the PFLP envisioned a socialist Arab world. This struggle was of crucial importance, not only because of the oil resources, but also for geopolitical reasons. The Persian Strait and the Suez Canal are the primary transport roads from Asia to Europe. In the 1970s, the PFLP had party cells in different Middle Eastern and North African countries. In general, the PFLP had a strong internationalist outlook. It allowed liberation movements from around the world to use its facilities. The first FSLN guerrilla fighters, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, were trained in a PFLP camp in Lebanon. During our visits, we saw Kurds, Turks, Iranians, South Africans, and Nicaraguans in PFLP camps. In other words, supporting the PFLP meant supporting many liberation movements at once. Finally, the PFLP was a well-established organization with a lot of potential. It had a proper armed wing with training camps. It ran clinics and children's homes, and even had a pension system for families of fallen or injured Fayadeen. It was essential for us to support organizations that did not stop at national liberation, but were eager to lead the struggle further toward economic and social liberation. The relation between CWC and PFLP grew stronger in the early 1970s. In August 1970, Al-Hadaf, the PFLP newspaper, published an article by CWC with the title, "Why Do We Support the PFLP?" If under the leadership of a petty bourgeois class, the national liberation movement results in the creation of an independent state with a flag and a national anthem of its own, political institutions and armed forces of its own, but does not result in a weakening of imperialism, can we support it? We can support it, yes. We must support it, yes, but not unreservedly. We must also criticize it. And if at one end at the same time there exists another movement in the same country, in the same part of the world, which strives to give proletarian leadership to the national liberation movement, which will not stop revolution halfways, but which has set out to mobilize the working class, the working people, to fight imperialism the whole way, then there can be no doubt as to whom we must support in the interest of socialist revolution, also in our own country, in the struggle of the Arab peoples against imperialism, Zionism, and Arabian reaction. We are therefore unreservedly supporting PFLP. Whom else should we support? In September 1970, members of CWC were visiting the PFLP in Jordan at the time of the hijacking and forced landing of two aircraft in the Jordanian desert. This action was part of an effort to stop the Jordanian regime's attacks on Palestinian refugee camps. The subsequent political discussions convinced the CWC that it was important to develop its material solidarity work with the PFLP. We were constantly contemplating on how to increase the organization's support for liberation movements. One of the possibilities was to acquire funds in illegal ways. The illegal practice started as an experiment after long and thorough discussions by its central core of the membership. As the first illegal actions were considered successful, it was decided to develop this practice. This, however, demanded some structural changes within the organization. In particular, security was tightened internally and in relation to outside partners. We had contacts with Palestinians living in Denmark, especially the Palestinian Workers' Union. However, we stopped that because of the intelligence service's close surveillance of Palestinians living in Denmark. We did not go directly from legal demonstrations and arranging flea markets to expropriating cash in transit trucks. CWC had been involved in illegal activities more or less since its founding. It assisted a group of Indonesian communists stranded in East Europe with false passports to secure them a secret return to Indonesia in order to reestablish the Communist Party after the Suharto massacre in 1965 to 66. Members had been painting slogans in support of the Vietnamese and Palestinian liberation struggles on public buildings and participating in violent demonstrations and street fighting. There is a significant step from these kinds of activities to acquiring money for liberation movements by illegal means. However, these activities functioned as a kind of bridge, providing a selection process for determining who is interested in participating in illegal activities. These actions were also the first learning steps in careful planning and secret communication. With the CWC's decision to develop the illegal solidarity work, a more careful training scheme was implemented, starting with small and simple tasks. It could be making a false driver's license and renting a car or stealing license plates. This illegal practice had a double purpose. One purpose was to provide third world liberation movements with material resources. The other was to familiarize CWC members with illegal work, which was deemed necessary in a future revolutionary situation. This was the practical extension of our twofold political strategy. First, liberation movements had to be supported in order to throw imperialism into a crisis, which would lead to a revolutionary situation in Europe. Second, a disciplined and organized group had to be ready to seize the opportunity when it occurred in our own country. As we were in it for the long haul, for tactical reasons, we needed to work undercover, not underground. The illegal activities had to look like ordinary apolitical crime. We wrote no communiques about expropriations and the like to explain or justify our actions. We knew that we didn't have any support among the Danish population. The undercover tactic made it possible for us to operate for almost 20 years. Had our illegal practice been openly political, it would have forced us to go underground and we would have been chased down in no time. The Red Army faction in Germany started out by attacking U.S. Army bases to support the anti-imperialist struggle in the Third World. Their actions were politically explicit and intended to shake up imperialism's hinterland. RAF wanted to tear off the democratic mask of the German political system and intended their actions to serve as an inspiration to the German masses. However, the Red Army faction were not fish swimming in the sea of the masses, to paraphrase Mao. RAF was quickly forced into a defensive underground struggle, which they were destined to lose. To successfully execute undercover illegal support work demanded certain skills. We were first of all required to develop secure communications and handle surveillance by intelligence services using counter-surveillance skills necessary because of the frequent transitions from legal and open political work to undercover illegal activities. These techniques had to be performed in an inconspicuous way in order not to attract further attention from the police. One mistake and our cover would be blown, not only for the individual, but for the whole organization. There were many other skills to be learned, some of which relied on our class position, with many coming from a well-behaved middle-class background. How to set up safe apartments to store material for planning meetings and bases for actions, and making false documents and identification papers. The skills from working at the publishing house were handy in making false documents. We used disguise techniques, uniforms, wigs, false beards, and makeup. Picking locks, stealing cars, sailing a boat, and flying a plane. The list of skills we acquired is long. In the preface to a book about our group, Klaus Wiemann, former member of the German 2nd of June movement, called us craftsmen of the world revolution. Up until the 1970s and 80s, we managed to execute a series of robberies and fraudulent activities generating millions of dollars. The success was based on careful planning and execution of actions. At that time, money transactions were still mainly made in cash. Our first step was to analyze the flow of cash in our society in terms of time of the month and places in the city. People draw out their salary from the banks by the first of the month. They paid their rent and other fixed expenses at the post office and used most of their cash at department stores within the first week of the month. The banks recollected the cash from post offices and stores. From the province cities, cash was transported by train to Copenhagen Central Station, and from there by truck to the post office downtown to be distributed to the bank headquarters. This information was gathered and confirmed by observation, sometimes using the quote-unquote latest technology of hidden video surveillance. The trick was to figure out when and where cash was concentrated, transported, and stored, and most importantly, easy to get access to. What was the best place and time to hit? How to get near the target without looking suspicious, and then hit quickly and precisely with a minimum use of force. Finally, we needed to have a well-planned escape route. As we continued the illegal praxis over the years, it was also important to change modus operandi, the way things were done, so it did not look like activities done by the same organized gang, but rather a series of different lucky punches by petty criminals. The decision to embark on and execute such praxis should never be taken lightly. In political practice, there is a real dilemma between the means and the ends. What means are just and suitable to obtain the desired ends? With regard to the liberation struggle, the ends are not petty issues. The end of the exploitation and oppression of millions. Does this end justify any means? Alternatively, do the ends never justify the means? Are the means part of the end? Do the wrong means compromise the ends? You inevitably encounter these dilemmas as a political militant. The answers to these questions are not general and abstract. They have to be related to the specific situation, the time, and place. The means must be adjusted to the scope of the struggle. We justified our limited use of violence in comparison the brutal imperialist war machine with the significant support that these means allowed us to provide to liberation movements. We experienced the difficult situation of the liberation struggles firsthand in visits. The struggle of the Palestinians was our struggle. They were our comrades and friends. The massacre of the Palestinian Tel Zatar refugee camp in 1976 and the Sabra and Shatila massacre in connection with the Israeli invasion in 1982 made a huge impression on us because we had visited these camps and talked to the people living there. In the period from September 1970 until April 1989, I would estimate that we used one-third of our time on development theory and strategy, one-third on legal solidarity and information, and one-third on illegal undercover work. This balance between developing theory and strategy on one side and the different kinds of praxis on the other is not a suggested baking recipe. The content and measurement of the ingredients of praxis and form of organization cannot be copied and pasted in time and space. Each specific situation needs a specific praxis and form of organization. Sometimes, when the world system is under transformation and the balance between the aspect and the principal contradiction is shifting, theoretical work has priority in order to figure out what's going on and adjust the strategy. In other periods, praxis, that is, action, is the priority in order to use opportunity to make a change. The split. This line of work continued rather up until the 4th of May 1978, when the major crisis in the organization broke out. In 1977, personal animosities and power struggles within CWC escalated. Originally, Gottfried Appel and Ulla Houghton were CWC's undisputed leaders, surrounded by enthusiastic but unschooled militants in their 20s. By the end of the 1970s, however, many members had a decade of political experience behind them. They had traveled, organized solidarity projects, and so on. They had matured and developed their own perspectives. Some of them were bothered by CWC's internal discipline and lack of democracy that didn't allow discussions leading to theoretical improvements and development of praxis. Neither the transformation of imperialism since the time of Lenin nor events like the oil crisis led to adjustments of CWC's political foundations. Ideas for projects were never put into practice because members were not used to doing things without receiving orders. Furthermore, there were personal conflicts. Ulla felt disrespected by male members. Gender discrimination was, without a doubt, a problem with CWC, and this was the time when the Red Stockings movement was strong, also in Denmark. Eventually, it all came to a head when female members, with the approval of the leadership, demanded that male comrades undergo criticism and self-criticism sessions. Men who refused to participate or did not respond in the right way were threatened with expulsion. This was serious, as the membership in CWC was central to CWC members' lives. CWC members were proud of their organization, maybe too proud, and sometimes a bit complacent. Politically, there was nowhere else to go either. All their social lives revolved around their comrades. The criticism and self-criticism sessions lasted through the winter of 1977-78 and effectively put a halt to all other activities. Female members demanded the expulsion of several men. Friendships and relationships were put to a test. Eventually, it became obvious to several members, both men and women, that things had gotten out of hand. On May 4th, 1978, members under threat of exclusion were called into a general meeting for all members except Houghton and Appel. It was actually the first time I experienced the whole organization was gathered in some kind of democratic process. The meeting's agenda was to end the anti-gender discrimination campaign and to analyze how things could have gone so wrong. What were the problems within our organization that had allowed this to happen? A few days later, Ulla and Gottfried were called to a meeting in order to present their views. Ulla was furious and insisted on the campaign continuing. Finally, Gottfried came to the meeting and alone and suggested to suspend all CWC activities for half a year. Then the leadership would present a proper analysis of the events. The majority of the members rejected this proposal. They wanted to analyze the reasons for the anti-gender discrimination campaign and the course it had taken themselves. In the end, the members expelled Ulla from CWC after a vote. Gottfried chose to remain loyal to his partner and left the organization. In July and August of 1978, CWC's political orientation, practice, and structure were discussed at numerous membership meetings. The balance between the anti-imperialist solidarity work versus mingling with the local left wing and participating in political struggles in Denmark was debated. Was the illegal work the wrong track, too time-consuming and risky? The development of theory continued. Did the parasite state theory hold water at all? On the sideline, all the sympathizers did not know what was going on, and the legal support work came to a standstill. In the process of evaluation over the months, different conclusions were drawn. It became obvious that there was disagreement about how to deal with the mistakes that had been made and how to move on. Papers with evaluations, future plans, theoretical reflections, and practical suggestions were written and discussed. It looked as if the debates would go on forever. Some of the members, including me, grew increasingly frustrated with the practical part of our work lying idle. We felt that if we had a responsibility both towards the Clothes for Africa activists and to the liberation movements we collaborated with. They were all wondering what was happening. We wanted to continue the political evaluation of CWC's history and the development of future perspectives, but we also wanted to go back to practical work. In August 1978, we presented our thoughts and announced the founding of a new organization. The former CWC was de facto split into three groups. Gottfried Appel and Ulla Houghton continued to work under the name CWC, which they had registered. They published the magazine Communist Orientation for a year or so, but never managed to build a new group. Appel was a great Marxist, but limited himself by only sticking to the narrow canon of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao. I learned much more being part of CWC's schooling and praxis than my later university studies. However, Appel's human resource management was not good. CWC could have really unleashed more energy and creativity by a more democratic and dialogue-based leadership. Other former members of CWC founded the Marxist Working Group. They intended to continue with the analysis of CWC's past mistakes while trying to develop a new form of organization and solidarity work. However, it was also short-lived and folded in 1980. The rest of us prepared for a new organization. We seized the assets of the old CWC. Things that were also related to the illegal practice were relocated to a new safe location. We reestablished contact with the liberation movements we had collaborated with and explained the new situation. The majority of the Clothes for Africa activists in Copenhagen and the chapter in Odense decided to work with us. Later, another chapter was established in Aarhus. We hired office space and established a print shop. Manifest Communist Working Group, MCWG, on this September 3rd, 1978, officially founded. In October, the first issue of our journal, Manifest, appeared. The first article outlined our perspectives and intentions. In a certain way, we felt like CWC's heirs, but we also wanted to develop our own analysis, improve our practice, and democratize the organization. MCWG's organizational goal became a bit different from the former CWC's. Even if Appel saw revolutionary development in Denmark as highly improbable, his intention and priority was to build an organization that had the resources, the knowledge, and the discipline to act once a revolutionary situation in the country would occur. In the end, his support for third world liberation movements had a clear Danish perspective. CWC was to be ready for the day the revolution was returning to Western Europe. For MCWG, supporting liberation movements was a revolutionary end in itself. Any possible revolution in Denmark was too far away and too abstract to even consider. Rather, we saw three things as crucial: to develop political analysis and theory, to spread our analysis and theory in order to mobilize more people, to expand the illegal and legal practice. We wanted to provide material support for liberation movements as an organization with a solid analysis. The Danish perspective moved further and further into the background and gave way to a thoroughly global perspective on the transition to socialism. One could say that MCWG was a reflection of globalization before we even became aware of it. Our new logo combined a globe with a five-pointed red star. The establishment of MCWG set a new energy free. We had been in the doldrums for almost a year. Now there were new possibilities. It was a small but hardworking group of more or less full-time activists. During the decade of MCWG existence, a few people left, others joined. The membership was around 15 to 20 people. Because of the illegal work, new members were only fully included after a year or so once we had gotten to know them well. There was a circle of 50 sympathizers and volunteers who helped with the legal solidarity work. Our journal Manifest had about 200 paying subscribers. The way MCWG was organized marked a rupture with the one-way centralism of CWC. We had an elected leadership, and there were bi-monthly meetings for all members. We wanted to form an organization able to develop its politics by way of internal as well as external discussion. Holger Jensen was a driving force in MCWG, as he had been in CWC. Because of his dedication and energy, he died in a traffic accident in 1980, which was a hard blow to us. However, the following years proved that MCWG had become grounded enough to continue its work. Administrative, theoretical, legal, and illegal tasks were divided on the basis of mutual agreement. This gave the organization stability, made it effective. It is obvious that the illegal practice set limits on how open CMWG MCWG could be internally. Only those involved in the illegal practice knew about the details, the need to know principle. But the decisions about which liberation movements to support were taken by the entire organization. We continued the illegal practice up through the 80s. It was time consuming, but there were other activities. The offset print shop made journals for African movements. IRE for a South African Black consciousness movement, and Liberation for an East African organization based in Dar es Salaam. There were also printed materials for Clothes in Africa, our own magazine, manifest, and pamphlets and books. The expenses for running the organization were exclusively paid for by member contributions, which depended on the individual's means. In some cases, those were quite high. Solidarity Work Clothes for Africa continued to send tons of clothes, shoes, and tents to camps hosting refugees from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, and Angola. We visited these camps to make sure all the deliveries arrived. We arranged monthly flea markets. The earnings went to political refugees from South Africa or to the PFLO in Oman in the Arab Gulf. In 1983, we published a book about the conflict in the Western Sahara. In 1985, we were involved in starting the Western Sahara Committee. We were also involved in the Philippines Committee and the El Salvador Solidarity Campaign. In 1987, we opened Cafe Liberacion, Cafe Liberation.
Hello? Is it just me? Oh,
No, it's not just you. He buggered off.
Yeah, but we're still on YouTube, so watch your tongue.
What me tongue? Well,
post on Discord.
it's the BBC.
Larry, what did you do to Anne?
I don't know. I'm going to try to
It's a
fix it.
coup. But Larry, you're a host, so you can maybe shut down YouTube.
Should I? I guess.
Yeah.
Now I have to figure out how to do that.
Oh, there you go. We're trapped forever on YouTube. This is the Twilight Zone.
Most tools. Let's see.